My father never talked about the storage unit. That was simply how it was. No explanation, no argument, no dramatic moment where he sat me down and told me to stay away. Just a quiet and absolute rule that had existed in our family for as long as I could remember. The same way certain drawers in the kitchen were his and you didn't open them. The same way you didn't ask about the phone calls he sometimes took in the car with the windows rolled up. Some things in our house just were. My parents, Walter and June Ashford, were not complicated people. Or so I believed for the first 42 years of my life. Walter was a retired electrician from Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of man who showed up when a neighbor's basement flooded and never once mentioned it afterward. June made soup from scratch every Sunday and kept a handwritten calendar on the fridge that tracked every birthday, every anniversary, every school event in our extended family going back years. They were present, steady, and entirely devoted to each other and to my sister Faye and me. They were not the kind of people who kept secrets. The storage unit was in Sudbury, off a service road behind the Home Hardware on LaSalle Boulevard. It had been rented in my father's name since 1991. I knew this because I found the paperwork after he died, tucked into a manila envelope inside the fireproof lockbox in his closet, which was itself something I was never supposed to open, though nobody had said so need saying. Walter died on February 9th, 2023. He was 71 years old. He had been managing a slow-moving heart condition for 6 years, which meant we knew, in the abstract way you know a thing you're not ready to face, that this was coming eventually. It still didn't feel like something that had been scheduled when I got the call at 6:40 in the morning and drove to Health Sciences North in the dark and snow and sat with my mother while the doctor used words I had heard on television but had never thought would be addressed to me. My mother June outlasted him by 11 weeks. She did not die of anything dramatic. She died of being 70 years old and having spent 47 of those years so thoroughly intertwined with another person that existing without him required a kind of effort her body quietly refused to make. Her doctor didn't call it broken heart syndrome, but I've read about it since and I know what I believe. She was sharp and present right up until the last week. She asked about my kids. She told Faye her chicken soup needed more dill. She said Walter's name in her sleep on the last night, which the palliative nurse told us was common, and which I found neither comforting nor uncomforting, just true. I buried them both before May. My name is Russell Ashford. I'm 42 years old. I teach high school history at Lockerbie Composite in Sudbury, which means I spend a significant portion of my professional life explaining to teenagers why the past matters, why understanding how things came to be the way they are is the only honest way to understand the present. I have been doing this for 15 years and I was not remotely prepared for the lesson my parents left me. My wife Corinne and I had been married for 12 years when my parents died. We have 2 kids, a daughter named Hazel who was 9 at the time, and a son named Theo who was 6. Corinne is a registered nurse at the same hospital where my father spent his last hours, which I don't think about too often because it doesn't go anywhere useful when I do. She is the most practical person I have ever met, which during the months after my parents died was either the best thing about her or the most difficult, depending on the day. The estate was not complicated. My parents owned their house on Elm Street outright. They had RRSPs, modest savings, a Canada pension plan. Faye and I were the sole beneficiaries. The executor was a lawyer named Roland Cheung, 63 years old, semi-retired, who had handled my parents' legal affairs for 20 years and who, when I sat down with him in late February, looked at me over his reading glasses with the specific expression of a man who knows something he has been instructed not to say. I noticed that look at the time. I filed it away. It was in April that I finally went through my father's lockbox properly. I had opened it once in February to find the will, pulled the document I needed, and closed it again because there was too much else to do. The second time I sat down with it properly, I found the storage unit paperwork. A lease agreement, renewed annually, going back to 1991. The facility was called North Storage Solutions. The monthly fee was currently $189. It had been charged to a bank account I didn't recognize, separate from the joint account my parents used for household expenses. A separate account running for over 30 years that neither Faye nor I had ever known about. I showed it to Corinne that evening after the kids were in bed. She looked at it for a long time. "Did you know this existed?" "No." "Did Faye?" I called her this afternoon. "No." Corinne set the papers down on the kitchen table. She had her thinking face on, which I knew well enough to let sit without interrupting. "You need to go there," she said finally. "I know." I called my closest friend, a man named Peter Okafor, 44 years old, who runs a small landscaping company in Sudbury and who has been my closest friend since we were paired as lab partners in grade 10 science, and have been, in some important sense, still working through the same experiment ever since. Peter is the kind of person who says the uncomfortable thing in the gentlest possible way, which makes him invaluable in a crisis. I told him about the storage unit. There was a pause on the phone. How long has it been rented? 32 years. Another pause. Okay, Peter said. When do we go? We went on a Saturday in late April. It was one of those northern Ontario spring days that can't quite decide what it wants to be. 7 degrees, overcast, patches of old gray snow still clinging to the shadowed sides of buildings like they hadn't gotten the memo. Peter brought coffee from Tim Hortons. We drove mostly in silence. The storage facility was clean and well maintained. A woman at the front desk confirmed that Walter Ashford's unit was number 34, in the back row, and that the estate would need to formally notify them within 60 days. She gave me a sympathetic look and a clipboard with forms on it, and I thanked her and we walked back. The unit had a roll-up metal door with a padlock. The key was on my father's keyring. I had found it weeks before and put it aside because it didn't match anything I could identify at the house. A small key, older than the others, with a green rubber grip on the head that had cracked slightly with age. I had carried it every day since February without knowing what it opened. It fit. The door rolled up with a sound that echoed off the concrete floor of the corridor. Peter and I stood in the entrance and neither of us said anything for a moment. The unit was roughly 12 by 20 feet. It was not full of boxes or furniture or the ordinary accumulated weight of a long life. It was, in a word, organized. Shelving ran along both side walls, floor to ceiling, the heavy-duty kind from a building supply store. On the shelves were binders, dozens of them, arranged by year with dates written on the spines in my father's careful block printing. Filing boxes labeled and stacked, each one with a handwritten contents card. A folding table against the back wall with a plastic storage bin on top, sealed and labeled. And on the wall above the table, pinned with pushpins into a sheet of corkboard, a map of Ontario. Handwritten notations in 2 colors of marker, red dots and blue circles and lines in black connecting certain towns. And photographs, a row of them, tacked directly to the corkboard. Men and women of various ages, some in groups, some alone, some candid, some formal, some with dates written on the back in the same block printing as the binders, my father in several of them, not at family gatherings, not at anything I recognized. Standing beside people I had never seen, in places I didn't know, I felt something happen in my legs. Not quite weakness, but a kind of sudden awareness of the floor. Peter put his hand on my shoulder. That was the right call. I took a breath. Then I walked to the shelving on the left wall and pulled down the first binder. Inside the front cover, in my father's writing, Northern Re-Entry Project. Intake Records, 1991-1990, Re-Entry. I knew that word from a context I hadn't expected to find here. I teach history. I know what re-entry programs are. I stared at the words for a moment, then I started reading. The binder contained intake forms, names, ages, circumstances, dates of release. Every person documented had recently been released from a correctional facility, Algoma Treatment and Remand Center, the Monteith Correctional Complex, the Thunder Bay District Jail. Men, mostly, but not exclusively. Ages ranging from 19 to 54. Each file also contained follow-up notes in my father's handwriting, dates of contact, what was discussed, what was needed, employment leads, housing referrals. 1. Recurring notation in the margins. Under confirmed stable. Follow-up in 90 days. I opened a second binder. 1994 to 1996. Same more files. Peter was reading over my very quietly, he said, "Russell, I see it. Your dad was running a re-entry support network." I didn't answer because I was already opening the filing box nearest to me. Inside, neatly organized, correspondence, letters sent and received, some from correctional services offices, some from community organizations, some handwritten from individuals, one from a man named DF, dated November 1997, 3 paragraphs. The last one read, "I don't think I would have made it through that first winter without the help you gave me. I want you to know that. I've got a job now, full-time, at a mill in Kapuskasing. I have an apartment. I'm okay." I sat down on the concrete floor, not a decision, exactly. Just where I ended up. Peter sat down beside me. Outside, somewhere in the facility, another metal door rolled open. Normal Saturday sounds. Life, which had not noticed what I was finding, carrying on. I need to explain how my father and I were, because this matters for what came next. Walter Ashford was not a closed-off man. He was warm, direct, physically demonstrative in the way that men of his generation sometimes are and sometimes aren't. He hugged without being asked. He told me he was proud of me at my convocation, and again when Hazel was born, and once, unprompted, when I called him after a hard week at work. He was present in every way I would have asked a father to be present. He also did not talk about the years before my mother. He didn't talk about his own father, a man I knew only from one photograph and from the word difficult, spoken once and never revisited. He didn't talk about the winter he spent, at 22, working a job somewhere in northern Quebec that he'd left before I was born. I knew there were rooms in my father's interior life that he kept closed. I had accepted that the same way he had accepted, without drama, that I would not always tell him everything either. Some silences between people are agreements, not absences. But 32 years, a separate bank account, binders going back to before I was born. That was not a silence, that was a whole other life, running parallel to the one I knew, behind a roll-up metal door off La Salle Boulevard. I got up eventually and went back to the shelves. I started reading in earnest. I found a binder near the end of the row, thicker than the others, labeled in my mother's handwriting. June had different handwriting from Walter, rounder and slanted, that said background and purpose. I opened it. Inside was a document, 23 pages, typed and dated September 1991, an explanation, in my father's words, of what he was doing and why. He had started the project, he wrote, because of a man named Arthur. He didn't give a last name. Arthur had been released from a federal correctional facility in 1989 with $40 in his pocket, a garbage bag with his belongings, and no plan. He had grown up in the same neighborhood as my father, in Sudbury, and when he got out, he had come to the only person he could think of who might not turn him away. He had sat in my parents' kitchen, at the table where I did my homework, and told my father that he had nowhere to go. My father had helped him, found him a room, connected him with an employment program, lent him money he never asked to be repaid. And when Arthur got back on his feet and thanked him, Walter had said something to June that she recorded in a journal entry included in the binder. He said the reason Arthur came to us was because most people wouldn't answer the door. He said he wanted to be the kind of person who always answered the door. And then, June had written, he went out to the garage and started making phone calls. That was 1989. It became the Northern Re-Entry Project in 1991, when my father formalized what had started as informal help to one man. He worked in coordination with correctional services liaison officers and community organizations across Northern Ontario. He kept records, because he believed records were the only way to prove, when the system insisted otherwise, that a person had tried and was trying and deserved another chance. He also worked quietly because, as he wrote in that September 1991 document, the people I'm helping have the right to put their past behind them without the world watching over their shoulder. What I'm doing doesn't need to be done. I set that page down and picked up the journal. June's journal. She had kept one from the beginning. A series of small hardcover notebooks, dated on the spine, tucked together in a plastic organizer on the second shelf. I pulled the earliest one, 1991, and I started reading. She wrote the way she talked, practically and warmly, with a precision that my father's block printing didn't quite capture. She wrote about the people Walter was helping, not by name but by situation. She wrote about the practical problems, the housing gaps, the employment barriers, the way a criminal record in a small northern city could close every door simultaneously. She wrote about what it cost them, financially and emotionally. They had funded this themselves primarily, some small donations from a handful of trusted people. The separate bank account had been June's idea. She wrote, cleaner, she said, less confusing, separate. And she wrote about me, and about my sister Faye, April 4th, 1994. Russell is 3 years old. He asked Walter today why there was a map on the wall in the garage. Walter said it was for keeping track of where people were. Russell asked what people. Walter said friends. Russell said okay and went back to playing. I thought about whether we're doing the right thing keeping this separate from him. And I think we are, for now. He's 3 years old. He doesn't need to carry this yet. October 19th, 2003. Russell turned 13 last week. He's old enough, I think, to understand some of it. But Walter isn't ready. He wants to wait until Russell is older. He says when he can look him in the eye and know he'll get it. I don't know exactly what that means, but I know Walter. He'll know when he knows. June 2nd, 2014, Russell's wedding today. Corinne is wonderful. I cried through most of the ceremony, which is not unusual for me. I thought at one point, watching them at the front of the church, that this is why we do it. Not just for Russell. For the children of the men we've helped. For the families that exist because someone had somewhere to go that first winter. I whispered this to Walter during the reception, and he squeezed my hand and said, "Almost there." I didn't ask what he meant. I knew. Almost there. Almost ready to tell me. I turned to the last notebook, 2022-2023. Her handwriting had changed in the last year. Not dramatically, but I could see it, a heaviness in the pen strokes that hadn't been there before. March 15th, 2022. Walter had his cardiology appointment. Dr. Mercier wants to adjust the medication again. Walter is not worried, or says he isn't, which is different. I am going to tell him tonight that it's time. Russell is 41 years old. If we wait until the right moment, we are going to wait forever. August 7th, 2022. We've decided, this Christmas. We tell Russell and Faye at Christmas. Walter has already started thinking about how to explain it. He keeps practicing opening lines when he thinks I'm not listening. I pretend not to notice. He would be embarrassed. And then the last entry. January 3rd, 2023. We didn't tell them at Christmas. Walter wasn't feeling well, and the moment never came, and we agreed, in that silent way of ours, to wait until he was stronger. I don't know how much longer to wait. I feel something I won't name pressing at the edges of things. We will tell them in the spring, when it's warmer, when it feels less like holding your breath. Walter died on February 9th, 2023. The spring never came for that conversation. I sat in that storage unit for a long time after I read that last entry. Peter had found a camp chair folded behind one of the shelving units, clearly left there on purpose, and he unfolded it silently and sat beside me. He didn't push me to talk. That's the thing about Peter. He has an instinct for when the right thing is just to be there. Some people talk to fill silence because they're uncomfortable. Peter is comfortable in silence in a way that makes you comfortable too. They were going to tell me, I said, eventually. I know, he said. They practiced. My dad practiced opening lines. Peter didn't say anything to that, which was correct, because there is nothing to say to that. I stood up and went to the folding table. On it, in the sealed plastic bin, I found what looked like the active files, current cases, organized by intake date. The most recent was dated November 2022, 3 months before Walter died. A man in his late 30s, released from a facility in Penetanguishene, referred by a community chaplain. My father's notes were thorough and specific. Housing confirmed in Sudbury. Employment referral made to a contractor he knew. Follow-up scheduled for February. The February follow-up had never happened. Underneath the active files was an envelope. Unsealed, not addressed, just the word, written on the front in my mother's handwriting. I stood there holding it for a moment. Peter said nothing. I opened it. Inside was a letter. 7 pages, cream stationery, my mother's handwriting, dated December 28th, 2022. 8 days before Walter went into the hospital for the last time. I'm not going to read you every word of it. Some of it is mine alone, but I'll tell you the shape of it. She started by saying she was sorry. Not the collapsing kind of sorry, not the kind that asks for absolution. The practical, clear-eyed kind, the only kind June Ashford knew how to do. She was sorry they had waited so long. She said the waiting had never felt like the right choice. Exactly, more like a choice they kept remaking without noticing they were making it. She said Walter had started this because of Arthur, and because of something in him that had never been fully explained. A winter in northern Quebec when he was 22 that he had never talked about, but that she believed had changed him in ways that mattered. She said she had always known that part of Walter was not hers to tell. She explained the project as clearly as she could in 7 pages, who they had helped, how, the organizations they'd worked with, the separate account which she had already spoken to Roland Chung about. That was the look he'd given me. I understood now. She told me there were currently 4 active files, men in various stages of transition, who had been connected to Walter's network, and who would need someone to follow up with them. She did not ask me to do this. She offered it. She said, "Your father was going to hand this to you himself, and I think that's still how it should work, handed rather than found. But we ran out of time, and so I'm leaving this here, and I'm trusting Carol at the facility." A woman named Carol Tremaine, the facility manager at North Storage Solutions, who had known my parents for 15 years, to tell you where it is when you come. I stopped, went back and read that sentence again. I walked out of the unit and back to the front office. Carol Tremaine was still at the desk. She was about 60, gray-haired, the careful professional manner of someone who has learned to be kind without making it a performance. I said, "Did my parents tell you about the letter?" She didn't seem surprised that I was asking. "Your mother came in February 2022, she said. She said if Walter passed before them having a certain conversation, she'd like me to give you a note. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small sealed envelope. My name on the front, June's handwriting. Inside, 3 sentences. The letter is in the bin on the table. Read it when you're ready, not before. Your father would have wanted Sunday morning, coffee, good light. Try to give him that even now. I don't know how long I stood at that counter. Carol Tremaine refilled the small paper cup of water she'd put in front of me without being asked and didn't say a word, which was exactly right. I went back to the unit. Peter had made no moves to leave. He'd found a second camp chair from somewhere. Actually, now that I think about it, probably behind the shelving on the other wall, and he handed me the last of the Tim Hortons coffee, which was cold by then, and I drank it anyway. I want to be honest about the anger, because this story earns that honesty. I was angry. I am a grown adult who spent 32 years living 10 minutes from a storage unit that contained an entire dimension of my parents' lives, and I did not know it existed. I teach my students that understanding the past is how you understand the present, and my own parents had quietly, carefully, and consistently kept me from understanding theirs. That is not a small thing. It does not resolve itself in a single afternoon. There were weeks, in May and June 2023, when I drove past the storage facility on LaSalle Boulevard and felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't admiration. It was the particular feeling of having been protected from something without being asked if you wanted to be protected, of being kept on the outside of a decision that was, in some fundamental way, about you. But here's the thing I kept landing on, in those weeks, sitting with the binders on the living room floor, while Corinne put the kids to bed, and Peter checked in by text and Faye called on Sundays to process it together. The people in those files didn't choose to need help. They were men and women who had done things they shouldn't have done, and served their time, and then stood at the edge of a world that had largely decided they didn't deserve a second look. And my father had looked. For 32 years, quietly, without recognition, he had looked. That's a fact. The secret and the fact coexist. I've stopped trying to choose between them. There was a letter that came in June 2023, forwarded from a P.O. box in Sudbury that I found in my mother's paperwork. She had always handled the correspondence. Walter handled the files. That was their division. It was from a woman named Bernadette, 61 years old, living in Timmins. She had found out through a community chaplain network that Walter Ashford had passed. She wanted to say something. She had been 23 years old in 1993 when, in her words, a man named Walter showed up at a halfway house in Sudbury with a list of job leads and the name of a landlord who was willing to give someone a chance. She had been out of a federal facility for 6 weeks. She had not expected anyone to show up with anything. She was now a licensed practical nurse. She had 3 adult children. She was, she wrote, doing fine by any measure that mattered. I named my youngest Walter, she wrote. He's 26 now. He doesn't know why I chose that name. Maybe I'll tell him. I called Peter after I got that letter. He said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Still working on it." He said, "Yeah." That was enough. There were more letters over the following months. Not many. Carol Tremaine had been careful and professional about how she'd communicated the news to the people connected to the project. But enough letters came that I understood the scope of what I was reading in those binders was not theoretical. These were people. These were ordinary lives that had wobbled and been caught, quietly, by 2 people in a ranch-style house in Sudbury who never once mentioned it at a dinner party. In September 2023, I drove to the offices of the Northern Ontario Re-Entry Coalition, a licensed nonprofit in Sudbury that I'd found referenced multiple times in my father's correspondence. I asked to speak to the executive director, a woman named Joanne Bissonnette, 58 years old, who had been working in reentry and community corrections advocacy for over 20 years. She came out to the lobby when the receptionist gave her my name. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you've been expecting them without wanting to say so. "You have your father's eyes," she said. That almost finished me, standing in a lobby in Sudbury on a Tuesday afternoon. She brought me back to her office, poured coffee, and told me that Walter Ashford had been a quiet but reliable partner to their organization for over a decade, providing documentation and case follow-up support that the formal system frequently couldn't sustain. "Your father kept records the way a good teacher keeps records," she said, and then seemed to remember who I was, which I suppose makes sense. She slid a folder across her desk. It was labeled, in my mother's handwriting, "For Russell," with Carol T. inside, a 12-page letter from my father. Typed this time, not handwritten. Dated October 2021. He wrote the way he talked, practically, without sentiment for its own sake, but with a directness that I felt like a hand on my shoulder. He explained what he had built and why. He explained Arthur, the man from the neighborhood, the kitchen table, the $40. He explained the winter he'd spent in northern Quebec at 22, which he had never spoken about, a construction job gone wrong, a charge that was eventually dropped, but not before 6 weeks in a remand center, in a small town where nobody knew him and nobody came. He wrote, "I know what it feels like to be on the other side of a door that nobody opens. Nobody. I decided a long time ago that I would be someone who opens doors. That is all this ever was." He described 4 men currently active in the files who would need someone to follow up with them. He named community contacts, organizations, a caseworker at a Sudbury transition house named Lawrence Dube, who had been a quiet ally for years. He said he hoped Faye would be involved if she wanted to be. He said he thought I would know what to do. At the end he wrote, "I'm sorry we waited so long. You're 40 years old, Russell, and you have been ready for this for years. Your mother kept telling me, and I kept saying soon, and I think what I was actually afraid of was that you'd be angry, and that the anger would be the thing you remembered instead of the rest of it. So I kept saying soon. I was wrong to do that. The garage was always going to be yours. I just needed too long to say so." I sat in Joanne Bissonnette's office for a long time. She had the grace to let me. What came next was not fast or simple. I spent the fall of 2023 going through 32 years of documentation. I met with Roland Chung to understand the financial picture. I met with a nonprofit lawyer in Sudbury named Wendy Fonseca, 46 years old, who specializes in community organization structures and who, when she understood what I was looking at, said very quietly, "This is remarkable what your parents built." "I'm starting to understand that," I said. I followed up with the 4 active files my father had left open. I did this with help from Joanne Bissonnette's organization and from Lawrence Dube, who turned out to be exactly the person my father's notes had suggested: careful, experienced, and deeply decent. One of the 4 men had already found stable housing through another channel. 2 were still in transition. The 4th, a man in his early 30s, I connected with a trades apprenticeship program in Sudbury that Walter had listed in his resource files as a reliable option. He called me 3 months later to say he'd been accepted. I didn't know what to say. I said congratulations. He said thank you. That was the whole conversation, and it was more than enough. Faye came up to Sudbury in November 2023. We spent a weekend in the storage unit together, reading, sorting, understanding. She cried more than I did, which is also just how we are. She said at one point, sitting on the floor with a binder in her lap, "I can't decide if I'm furious or proud." I said, "You don't have to decide." She looked at me. "When did you get philosophical?" It's a hazard. On December 1st, 2023, I made a decision. I was not going to close the storage unit. I was not going to archive what was in it or fold it into some institutional structure that would manage it from a distance. I was going to keep it running, not identically. Some of what my father had done informally needed better structure, clearer documentation, legal clarity about how I was engaging with the system. But the core of it, the follow-up, the records, the quiet, sustained attention to people who needed someone to answer the door, that stayed. I was 42 years old. I taught high school history. I knew nothing practically speaking about corrections or re-entry or community advocacy. What I knew was how to read documents, how to ask the right questions, and how to be stubborn about outcomes. Walter's stubbornness. June had said so herself, in that journal entry from 1994, when I was 3 years old, banging around in the kitchen, not knowing what was being built 10 minutes away. Joanne Bissonnette agreed to guide me. Wendy Fonseca agreed to help formalize the structure. Peter, who had been there at the beginning, in that storage unit with cold coffee and a folding camp chair, agreed to help me set up a proper filing system and get the paper records digitized. We started in January 2024. I want to say something honest about the anger, because I think anyone who hears this story deserves the honest version. I have not resolved it completely. I'm not sure resolution is the right word. My parents loved me and spent 32 years quietly, consistently deciding that I wasn't ready for something that was, in some fundamental way, mine. That's a real thing. I don't minimize it, but I also think about what's in those binders. The people who got a phone call back when they didn't expect one. The man in Kapuskasing with his apartment and his mill job. Bernadette in Timmins with her 3 kids and her youngest named Walter. But the man who got into the apprenticeship program and called me from a number I didn't recognize to say thank you. Those 2 things are both true at the same time. My parents, they kept was that they were good. I am allowed to be angry about the keeping. I'm also allowed to be grateful for what was kept. Most days, I manage both. The storage unit on LaSalle Boulevard still has the same roll-up metal door. I repainted it, which my father would have considered unnecessary, but I did it anyway. The padlock is the same one. The key with the cracked green grip is on my keychain now, where Walter kept it for years. The fluorescent lights overhead still take a few seconds to fully come on when I flip the switch. I've replaced the tubes once, they still hesitate. I've come to find it grounding, that hesitation, the moment between dark and light. The map is still on the corkboard. I've added to it. My own notations are an orange marker, distinct from Walter's red and black. Cases I've been involved with since January 2024. They're mine, and I know which ones are his and which ones are mine, and the difference matters and also doesn't. Some mornings I drive there before school. I park in the back lot and I open the door and I stand in the middle of 32 years of evidence that two ordinary people in a mid-sized city in northern Ontario decided without recognition, without applause, without anyone knowing to answer the door. My father would have told me on a Sunday. I know it, the way I know the things about him I can't explain with evidence. He would have made coffee, the good stuff he kept for occasions, and he would have told my mother to take her morning walk, and he would have sat me down at the kitchen table and said something like, "Russ, there's something I should have shown you a long time ago." He would have said it simply, the way Walter handled things that weren't simple. He would have put the key with the green grip on the table between us and let it sit there until I picked it up. I would have given a great deal for that Sunday. Instead, I have a storage unit, a key, and 32 years of quiet proof that my father always answered the door. I think that's enough. I think he always knew it would be.